Hello, this is Pamela with Pamela's Portrayals, and today I'm going to just do a real quick lesson in the differences between watercolor, gouache, and ink. I'm not going to go into the characteristics or how you use them. I want you to see how they look different or similar. So for today's lessons, I'm just going to use a regular synthetic brush. I've got my watercolor here, my gouache here. Notice that they look very similar. And then I'm going to be using ink, but I will be using that later because the ink dries really quickly. The watercolor and the gouache you can reactivate with water. So to start with, I've labeled my papers with watercolor, gouache, and ink. And I'm just going to get some water and I'm going to just wet my paper. Now this is just simply an exercise to show you the differences or similarities of these three mediums that you use water with. It will bow your paper. A lot of people will tape it down, but for this demonstration I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to use the same basic color for the background of all of them. This is kind of a yellow ochre color, and I'm just going to kind of drop that in. And again, I'm not really talking about technique or anything. I just want to show you the differences. Now I've dropped this in and I've kind of just filled all that water in with the paint. I'm going to rinse my brush off. Now I'm going to do just some leaves. I'm going to take this bamboo skewer, it's got a sharp end on here, and I'm going to just kind of draw in like this a thing, and maybe just do some leaves, just a couple leaves. Some of you may have seen a painting that I did earlier and that I posted on Facebook on my Pamela's Portrayals site, and I told you I was going to do a video, and this is the video I'm doing regarding that. And we're just going to, now you notice I did not use a pencil or anything. You certainly can, but for this lesson I'm just going to try to use the same technique on all three. So I've got that one going. So next I'm going to do my gouache as this one's drying. And I'm going to wet, once again, the surface, just like I did before. And I am again going to use the gouache this time, and the gouache you see is a little deeper in color. That is because of the binder that's used. It's a thicker, almost chalky, like watercolor, more opaque. So I've got this one on. You of course can make this lighter if you add more water, but I've used an equal amount of water, so you can see that's still going to turn out darker. And again, I'm going to come back and I'm just going to draw this in with this skewer. Okay, and now I'm going to do the ink. Now there's a couple of different ways that you can do this ink. I am just going to drop it in and move it around. You can certainly put it on your plate and dip your brush in it, but I'm just going to do it this way for right now. So here's my ink. This is an acrylic ink. I also have regular like India ink, and you can use these interchangeably. There is some differences in them, but like I said, I'm going to do individual classes on each of these mediums. That's kind of cool effect, isn't it? Okay, so you notice that the ink is a lot darker, and of course, once again, we can lighten that up if we add more water to it. But the ink is going to be a more solid color, and it does work differently. All right, so let's go ahead and do our line and our little leaves. This tip of this one is kind of got a little breaking off there, so I'm going to use a toothpick. Oh, that one's breaking off too, but it'll still work. And you can use a toothpick if you don't want to buy bamboo skewers. Okay, so I've got all three of them now, and you can see what they look like. Again, the watercolor is the lightest, the gouache is just a little bit darker, and the ink is darker, but again, you can change the colors by how much water, how much medium that you use. Let this dry completely. I did want to let it dry. The watercolor, of course, is drying quicker. The ink has taken a little bit longer, but it dries really quick also. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use orange, and I'm going to color orange watercolor, and I'm going to color in this leaf right here. Now where I etched with the bamboo stick, you can see that it outlines it. I'm going to go ahead and get the orange of the gouache. I'm going to do the same thing here. Now this is still wet. If you wanted a crisper line, you would let this gouache dry. Now I'm going to do the ink right here. Now for that, I'm going to actually drop my orange right here, my orange ink, because if I drop this here, it's going to go everywhere. So I want to have it kind of controlled. Still wet, so it is going to travel. But I'm going to try to just kind of put it on thick, and there you have it. Now I'm looking at this, I probably should have let this one dry a little more because the pigment is filtering out into the surrounding area. So one way we can control our color is we can dry it, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to come back with the gouache, the orange gouache. I'm going to put it back on there. Still a little damp, but that gives you kind of a better idea. The watercolor, unless you use a lot of pigment, is going to naturally be lighter. The gouache will be a little bit darker, and then of course the ink is going to be the darkest. You can get these to look very similar using more water, more or less water, more or less pigment. So now I'm going to go and let's use a red. Let's put a red color in there, watercolor first. And you can see I'm using about the same amount of water and pigment as I did with the others. So here's the red. Now this one is a little thicker. I put a little bit more pigment on it. And let's see how dry that is. Put a little bit of red over here. This is the gouache. And again, as this is drying, you can see that even though this started out really dark, it's lightening up. This should stay pretty close. It'll be a little bit lighter, but it should stay pretty close to that color. And now I'm using my red ink, and again, I'm going to drop a little bit on my page, or my plate. I don't put it on my paper because this is still pretty wet and it will just flow everywhere. Come over here and get some of that red, and we'll just put that right here. And you can see how that is just really a lot darker color. It's still flowing out because of the water on the page. Now we're going to use a green and green watercolor. Now my green watercolor is a little different. I used quite a bit of paint and not a lot of water there. So I'm going to try to give that the same consistency using more medium. And I'll do the same here. I cleaned my brush off, so I'm going to use more medium. Okay, put the green right here. And it is a different shade because I did not have this shade in the watercolor. And now I'm going to get a green. This here, when you're using a watercolor or an ink or a gouache, when you have this bleeding out, this is, you can take a paper towel or a tissue paper or something and blot it up. But that is obviously not how I would do a painting, but I was just not wanting all the paint to run off and have that not look as dark as it should. Okay, I'm going to do the green now. And get the ink on my brush, and we'll just pull it up here. Then we'll do one more color, the yellow. Okay, as this is drying, you can see that these colors are lighter than these colors. This is the gouache, the watercolor, and the ink. The ink is the darkest, watercolor is the lightest, and the gouache is somewhere in the middle. But the gouache has, whereas this has, you can see through it, this one a little bit you can see through it, but the colors are still more vivid. But the gouache, this green in particular, looks kind of chalky. I don't know if you can see that on your screen or not. Then we're going to do the yellow. And we'll just put the yellow up here. The yellow is, of course, a light color anyway, so it's going to be really transparent. Let's try the gouache yellow. I don't know if you can tell this here. With watercolor, you can get cakes of it. I use the tube, which is a softer medium than the hard cakes. You add water to both of them. This will dry, and you can add water to reactivate it. The same is true here, but this is a thicker. The gouache is thicker. I don't know if you can tell that because this looks just as thick. But the gouache, in looking at it like this here green that's pulled out, it's really solid and chalky looking if you were seeing this in person. Okay, let's put this green or this yellow here. And again, this yellow is looking darker than the other. But is it going to be as dark as the ink? And I'm using an India ink. Now I have used both types of ink here. I've used acrylic ink and India ink. I will tell you in the next videos, I will tell you the differences in that. So here is the yellow. And like I said, with the ink, you can still see through it. You can still see those lines. The gouache, not really as much. You can see a little bit there, but I came back over it. But with the watercolor, you can also see through it and see the lines that are in it. Okay, that is all I'm going to do today. I just wanted you to see the difference. I'm going to wait a little bit, let this completely dry so you can see what the finished product looks like. These are dry, and as you can tell, the watercolor You have the color, but it's still, you can still see through it. This is more chalky. Like if you look at that, this is, if you was to put a pencil mark on here and then go over it with the gouache, you wouldn't see the pencil mark. Whereas with this and this, you would. That is why I didn't want pencil marks. That is why I used a skewer, a bamboo skewer, to just kind of etch, and then the paint will go, the pigments in the paint will go into the little etched areas. Now, you may not want to do that. You may say, well, I need more detail, and you can certainly use a pencil. I would use a light pencil, a hard pencil, to lightly sketch in, and we will go over that when I actually do the paintings in each of these mediums. I just real quickly want to go over with you some of the equipment that I am using. These are just very simple synthetic brushes. You can get these just about anywhere. These I think I got from Michael's. They're Craft Smart. You can also get the Artist Loft brushes, which are also synthetic, pretty cheap. Like you can get a set of these for probably $8. The Artist Loft would be real similar to that price. For watercolors, gouache, and ink, a lot of people like a natural hair. Now this is a really cheap natural hair. These are Artist Loft, again from Michael's, and these are pony hair. The bad thing about these, they hold a lot of water and pigment, but the problem is the hairs come out and you'll have little hairs all over your painting. But if price is something that's important to you, you could certainly get them. They're actually cheaper than the synthetic. I would suggest the synthetic though, because they'll last longer and you don't have to worry about the hair. The other thing, brushes that we have, if you wanted to invest in a good quality set, there is Grumbracher, which has a natural hair, and this would be like a natural squirrel. Normally squirrel is your preferred natural medium or natural brush for watercolor. This is a Winsor Newton, and it is goat hair. This is a really nice brush for large washes to put on that. These are very expensive though. This brush is probably close to $20, and this brush is probably real similar, with probably about $17, $18 each. So I would suggest the synthetic brushes, like either the Artist Loft or these Craft Smart. Any kind of synthetic brush would be good for this. Now I wanted to go over the mediums. I have 3 different kinds of ink. This is Dollar Rowney and the FW brand. This is an acrylic ink. This runs about $6 at Hobby Lobby. I have the Bombay, Dr. Phil Martin, or Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay India inks, and that also runs about $6. These are 1 ounce bottles. This is also a 1 ounce bottle, but it is the Liquitex acrylic ink, and these run about $8. Some of the colors actually are more, and those are each. For the watercolor, there is this you can get at Michael's, Artist Loft, $6, and you get all of these colors. Now this is obviously, the pigment isn't as good as if you bought something else, but this is a great set to start with. So if you bought this for say $6 and then another $8 for your brushes, you know, about 15 bucks for the paint and the brushes. And then of course we're going to talk about paper another day, but that's a good price. The watercolor can be expensive. This is a Winsor Newton gouache, but it's basically the same price as the watercolor, and you're going to pay, I would say, anywhere from $9 up for 1 tube of this. This here is Daniel Smith. Max and I like the Daniel Smith. It has a lot of good vibrancy, really smooth to work with, really nice. This is an American-made watercolor. It's made in Seattle. This is a little bit more expensive. You could probably, maybe you might be able to get some for $8 or $9, but most of the time this is going to be $10 and up for this size. So these are real comparable in price, but I just like this better. For the gouache, if you're wanting to use the gouache, we would use the same type of brushes that I described before. This is the gouache paint, and again, you get multiple tubes of it for about $6, $7. And if you wanted to go with the more expensive brand, this is a liquid gouache that comes in these little tubes. This is a small tube. You don't buy these individually. Normally they come in 2-ounce tubes that are about $10 to $15 each. This you get a set of 12 for about $70, I think. So that's kind of expensive. Probably don't want to use that. They also come individually like this, about $10 and up. So I think if you're going to start, I would start with the Artist Loft, the gouache, or the watercolor. This will be about the same price for both. As you get more experience with it, you might want to switch to the more expensive brands. Now with this, obviously, the Liquitex ink is a little bit more money. These about $6 each, and I will be giving you a list if you decide you want to go with, something different than these two that I explained to you, the watercolor or the gouache. And actually, these are so cheap you could actually buy both and try both of them, because you'd use the same brushes for them. The inks I know are more expensive, but look at the difference in the vibrancy of the color that you get with it. So, all right, so I'm going to go now. As I explained, the reason I use this skewer after I painted the watercolor on, or the gouache or the ink, was because I did not want pencil marks in there. If you feel like after you're done and you say, oh gosh, these are still too lighter than what I wanted, you can go back. One of the things that you can use is this is a Faber-Castell, and this is India ink. It's waterproof. So let's say I wanted to go on my watercolor, and I just wanted, this is a bold, so it's a thicker nib here. You can get thinner ones that are really, really thin, and I'll show you the difference in that. But let's say you wanted to just kind of outline this and give yourself just a little bit different look. You can do that. Let me get one that's thinner. This is a fine point, and you can tell the difference. So for this, you could go in and give little thinner lines. The other thing we can do is, if I wanted, I like this burnt umber color, and with the inks, if they sit for very long, you will need, the color can build up on the bottom, and you just kind of need to shake them a little bit, which is what you saw me doing. And I just tapped a little bit out on my plate. And I'm going to use this, and I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to use this on the acrylic ink. So I've absorbed some of that ink there, and then I can come back and actually just kind of make this darker. I could say, that wasn't dark enough for me. I wanted to add some. This ink absorbs right into that bamboo skewer. And you can then, outline it if you wanted to, like that. Another way you could do it, and this would work better, I think, with the gouache and the watercolor, is get a thin brush, and you want to wet that. Come over here into my brown watercolor, and this is drying, but you can see I can reactivate it. And maybe, since this is watercolor, I'll put this over here, and we can do a thin line like that. And you do want some smaller brushes so that you can do more fine detail work with. So that is the watercolor. And I'm going to use the gouache. I don't have a brown with the gouache. I've got this kind of reddish brown. And basically it's the same thing. You would come in and outline like this. So it's real similar, but this is just, like I said, more chalky. I'm not sure if you can see that. Now, let's say you said, oh, I would like to, can I use the skewer on the watercolor like I did with the ink? Well, let's see if we can do that. So we're going to come over here to the brown and get the skewer, get some paint on that, and you absolutely can. Because you're not adding water to it, it's going to be a little bit darker. You're also going to use a lot of paint that you won't be using if you use that. So it's just up to you. Same thing with the gouache. We can do that. I'm going to clean off because this is a little bit different color, so I'm going to dip that in there. Now obviously if you were using dry watercolor, you would have to wet it first. This is kind of dry, this gouache is drying, so I'm going to have to add a little water to it. But see, it will also work. You can get a set of bamboo skewers, a whole bunch of them, for about $8 if you want them. You can also use toothpicks. Toothpicks do kind of go through those a little quicker because they're just not as thick. And so I think I've covered everything except for the watercolor paper. Now, I use the same watercolor paper here. I use the Strathmore, which is about a medium grade watercolor paper. It will take like some water, obviously. You saw me put the water on here. I was able to go back over it nicely. It didn't peel or anything. Some of the cheaper watercolor papers, for example, like the Artist Loft or a Hobby Lobby brand, they will, when you go over it, the paper will start to peel off and ball up. Those are fine if you want to just practice a technique, but I would not try to do your paintings on that. So I would probably get Strathmore or Canson for just a medium watercolor. You can, as you get better and want to do more detailed painting or more paintings with a lot of water on it, you are going to want to go with a higher quality paper. I believe Arches is probably one of the best. There are so many different brands of paint and watercolor and brushes and everything that I'm certainly not going to say one is absolutely the best because I haven't tried them all. But Arches would be a very good brand to use. So I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope you can see the differences in this, and I want you to think about, if you want to take a class with me, which medium you'd like to use. I do realize that this is the more expensive medium to use. I personally like it and do a lot of my paintings in it. This is one of the recent paintings I did with the acrylic ink, and I just like the vibrancy of it. But I will be doing watercolor paintings, gouache paintings, and ink paintings. So if you have any questions, please shoot me a message on Messenger on my Facebook page, Pamela's Portrayals, and I will be happy to get back with you and discuss any questions that you have. Thank you very much.